There is a moment in every empath's life that almost nobody notices when it happens. No screaming, no dramatic goodbye, no final argument that shakes the walls. Just silence. A silence so complete that the people who once had unlimited access to them suddenly realize they are standing outside a locked emotional door they will never open again. Because contrary to what most people believe, empaths are not endlessly patient. They are not emotionally indestructible. They are not infinite wells of forgiveness designed to absorb betrayal forever. In fact, the most dangerous thing you can do to an empath is not hurting them once. It is making them feel emotionally unsafe repeatedly while expecting them to continue loving you the same way. That is the breaking point. Most people misunderstand empaths because they confuse compassion with weakness. They assume the empath will always return, always explain, always try again. Always give one more chance, because that is what the empath has done for years. But something terrifying happens when an empath finally sees a painful truth clearly. Some people do not love connection. They love access. Access to the empath's energy, access to their attention, access to their emotional labor, access to their forgiveness. And once the empath realizes the relationship only survives through their suffering, something inside them changes permanently. Not loudly, quietly. The empath begins withdrawing emotionally long before they disappear physically. Their messages become shorter. Their emotional openness shrinks. Their nervous system stops feeling safe around you. The warmth in their eyes slowly disappears. And most people miss this stage completely because the empath still looks present on the outside. But internally, they are grieving the relationship while still inside it. This is why people are often shocked when an empath finally leaves. They think it happened suddenly. It didn't. The empath already spent months or years trying to save a connection that kept teaching them they were only valued for what they tolerated. And eventually, exhaustion becomes clarity. That is the moment the empath stops trying to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding them. Because the empath's final stage is not revenge. It is emotional detachment. And once an empath reaches true detachment, something almost impossible happens. The person who once gave endless emotional energy becomes unreachable. Not because they hate you, but because they finally love themselves enough to stop bleeding for people who never cared about the wound. The terrifying part? Most people only realize the empath was rare after they are gone. After the emotional support disappears. After the unconditional patience disappears. After the deep listening disappears. After the warmth disappears. Suddenly the world feels colder. Because genuine empaths bring emotional safety into spaces without people even realizing it. And when that energy vanishes, the absence becomes louder than their presence ever was. In this video, we will uncover the psychological behaviors that make an empath disappear forever. The silent emotional shifts that happen before they leave. And why the people who break empaths often spend years haunted by the loss they created. The first thing that slowly destroys an empath is consistent emotional invalidation. Not disagreement, invalidation. There is a difference. Disagreement says, I see your feelings, but I view the situation differently. Invalidation says, your feelings are irrational, dramatic, inconvenient, or wrong. And for an empath, this cuts deeper than most people understand, because empaths experience life through emotional sensitivity. They naturally absorb tension, shifts in tone, hidden resentment, and emotional contradictions others overlook. So when they express pain, they are usually not reacting to one isolated moment. They are reacting to a pattern, a pattern they felt long before they had words for it. But toxic people often weaponize this sensitivity against them. You're overthinking. You're too emotional. You always make things deeper than they are. At first, the empath questions themselves. Maybe I am too sensitive. Maybe I expect too much. Maybe I should stay quieter. And this is where the emotional erosion begins. Because empaths do not immediately leave relationships that hurt them. They adapt to survive them. They shrink themselves. They explain themselves less. They suppress intuition to maintain peace. They tolerate emotional loneliness just to avoid conflict. But the human nervous system can only endure emotional self-betrayal for so long before something breaks internally. Eventually, the empath realizes something devastating. They are constantly being asked to ignore their emotional reality to protect someone else's comfort. That realization changes everything. Because once an empath notices, they are always the one apologizing for having emotions. Always the one simplifying their pain. Always the one translating basic empathy into a language others refuse to learn. Their soul becomes tired. Not angry, tired. And emotional exhaustion is dangerous because it transforms compassion into detachment. The empath begins observing instead of participating, listening instead of opening up, withdrawing instead of explaining. This is usually the stage where the other person becomes confused. Why are you distant? Why don't you talk like before? Why do you seem cold? But they fail to understand something critical. The empath did talk, many times. The problem was never communication. The problem was that the empath's emotional reality was only welcomed when it was convenient. And once an empath feels emotionally unsafe for long enough, they stop seeing the relationship as home. They start seeing it as survival. That is the beginning of disappearance. Not physical disappearance first, emotional disappearance. And once an empath emotionally leaves a relationship, the physical goodbye is only a matter of time. One of the fastest ways to lose an empath forever is to make them feel emotionally alone while standing right beside them. This is a loneliness far more painful than physical isolation. Because physical loneliness says, there is nobody here. But emotional loneliness says, someone is here, and they still do not see me. Empaths can survive hardship. They can survive stress. They can survive chaos. But what slowly destroys them is feeling unseen in relationships where they continuously give their heart away. Most empaths enter connections with extraordinary emotional generosity. They listen deeply. They remember small details. They notice changes in mood before words are even spoken. They instinctively try to reduce suffering in the people they love. But over time, unhealthy people begin treating this emotional devotion as something automatic, expected, guaranteed, permanent. The empath becomes the therapist, the fixer, the emotional caretaker, while their own emotional needs slowly disappear into the background. And at first they tolerate it because empathy naturally makes them understanding. They tell themselves they're struggling. They've been hurt too. They don't know how to express emotions. So the empath keeps giving more patience, more reassurance, more understanding, more emotional labor. But eventually a painful imbalance forms. The empath becomes emotionally responsible for everyone, while nobody becomes emotionally responsible for the empath. That imbalance creates silent resentment. Not because the empath expects perfection, but because they begin realizing they are loved most when they are useful. That realization wounds deeply. Because empaths do not want transactional love. They want emotional reciprocity. They want to feel chosen emotionally, not merely depended on psychologically. And the terrifying thing is that many people only recognize the empath's value after the energy disappears. After the empath stops checking in, stops comforting, stops emotionally carrying conversations, stops fighting to maintain the connection alone. Suddenly the relationship feels empty. But it was never the empath's job to single-handedly keep it alive. This is where the empath begins transforming internally. The constant emotional giving becomes exhaustion. The exhaustion becomes numbness, and the numbness becomes clarity. The empath starts noticing something they ignored for years. They feel more peaceful alone than emotionally neglected beside someone. That discovery is life-changing. Because once solitude feels safer than connection, attachment begins dying naturally. The empath no longer chases, no longer begs for emotional presence, no longer explains why basic care matters. Instead, they slowly detach in silence. And the frightening part is that this detachment often looks calm from the outside. No dramatic speeches, no emotional explosions. Just a quiet emotional shutdown that becomes impossible to reverse. Because once an empath accepts that they cannot force people to care deeply, they stop trying to earn love through self-sacrifice. And that is usually the moment they begin disappearing for good. Nothing makes an empath disappear faster than betrayal disguised as love. Especially when the empath stayed loyal through things most people would have walked away from long ago. Because empaths do not attach casually. They attach emotionally, spiritually, psychologically. When they love someone, they invest pieces of their identity into the connection. They remember your wounds. They study your fears. They protect your vulnerabilities as if they were their own. That is why betrayal affects empaths so deeply. It is not just the action itself. It is the horrifying realization that someone they emotionally protected was secretly damaging them at the same time. And the deepest betrayals are rarely sudden. They happen slowly, through dishonesty, manipulation, emotional inconsistency, broken promises, disrespect repeated so often it becomes normalized. At first, the empath tries to repair things. They communicate calmly. They seek understanding. They give second chances because they genuinely believe people can grow. But repeated betrayal creates psychological fragmentation inside the empath. Their intuition says, "This relationship is hurting you." But their compassion says, "Keep trying." That internal war exhausts them. Because empaths often stay too long hoping the version of someone they once loved will return. But eventually, reality becomes impossible to ignore. The empath notices that apologies never lead to change. The pain keeps repeating in different forms. The relationship survives only because the empath keeps forgiving what should never become normal. And this is where something cold begins forming inside them. Not cruelty, clarity. The empath starts emotionally disconnecting from the fantasy of who they hoped the person would become. That shift is irreversible. Because once an empath stops believing in the emotional future of a relationship, attachment begins collapsing rapidly. The person who once defended you now becomes emotionally quiet. The person who once chased resolution now withdraws. The person who once begged for honesty now watches in silence. And most people completely misread this stage. They think the empath is becoming less emotional. In reality, the empath is becoming emotionally self-protective. They are finally recognizing that loyalty without respect becomes self-destruction. This realization awakens a powerful instinct inside them. The instinct to protect their peace at all costs. And once an empath enters that stage, access to them changes forever. Because they no longer confuse unconditional love with unlimited tolerance. They stop romanticizing suffering. Stop trying to heal people who enjoy hurting them. Stop sacrificing emotional stability to preserve toxic attachment. And when an empath finally leaves after betrayal, they rarely come back the same. Because betrayal does not merely break their heart, it changes the way they distribute trust forever. One of the most painful mistakes people make with empaths is assuming their forgiveness means they are incapable of leaving. But forgiveness and tolerance are not the same thing. Empaths often forgive because they understand human pain deeply. They can see the wounded child behind destructive behavior. They can recognize trauma beneath anger, insecurity beneath arrogance, fear beneath control. This is why toxic people become dangerously comfortable around empaths. The empath understands too much. They keep seeing the humanity in people who repeatedly fail to protect theirs. And for a long time, the empath mistakes this emotional endurance for love. They believe loyalty means staying. They believe compassion means absorbing pain. They believe patience will eventually inspire change. But eventually, a terrifying realization emerges. Some people do not heal when given love. Some people simply become more comfortable hurting the person who keeps forgiving them. That realization shatters something inside the empath. Because the empath suddenly understands that their empathy has been exploited instead of respected. The relationship becomes emotionally predictable. The same disrespect, the same apologies, the same temporary affection, the same repeated wounds. A cycle. And cycles are psychologically devastating because they train the nervous system to live in emotional instability. The empath begins feeling anxious before conversations, emotionally drained after interactions, mentally exhausted from constantly analyzing behavior. Their body starts reacting before their mind fully accepts the truth, because the nervous system always recognizes danger before denial ends. This is usually when the empath begins awakening emotionally, not through anger, through exhaustion. The emotional fog starts lifting. The excuses stop sounding convincing. The manipulation becomes easier to identify, and suddenly the empath sees the relationship for what it truly is. A place where they are loved conditionally, while expected to give unconditionally. That imbalance becomes unbearable. Because empaths can survive pain, but they cannot survive permanent emotional starvation. At some point, self-respect becomes stronger than attachment. That is the turning point most people never see coming. The empath stops arguing, stops defending themselves, stops trying to prove their worth. And strangely, this calmness often confuses toxic people more than emotional reactions ever did. Because they were prepared for tears, prepared for emotional pleading, prepared for another cycle. They were not prepared for detachment. Not the cold detachment of hatred. The peaceful detachment of someone who finally understands they deserve better. And once an empath reaches emotional acceptance, their departure becomes almost impossible to stop. Because they are no longer leaving impulsively, they are leaving consciously. Leaving because their soul can no longer survive in environments where love always comes attached to pain. That is when the empath disappears not out of revenge, but out of self-preservation. The final stage before an empath disappears is strangely quiet. No dramatic announcement. No desperate final conversation. No emotional performance designed to make someone finally understand their pain. By this point, the empath has already crossed an invisible psychological threshold internally. They are done hoping. And when an empath loses hope in a relationship, something profound changes in their energy. The emotional intensity vanishes first. The person who once fought for connection suddenly becomes calm. The person who once over-explained their feelings becomes brief. The person who once feared losing people starts accepting loss with unsettling peace. This calmness is often misunderstood. People think the empath no longer cares, but the truth is far more painful. The empath cared for too long without being cared for correctly in return. Eventually, the nervous system reaches emotional burnout, the constant disappointment, the emotional inconsistency, the repeated betrayal of trust, the feeling of never truly being safe. It all accumulates quietly over time until the empath reaches emotional numbness. And numbness is dangerous because it signals the heart is no longer fighting to stay connected. This is the stage where the empath begins reclaiming themselves. They reconnect with solitude, rediscover inner peace, start noticing how heavy certain people always made them feel. For the first time in a long time, they stop centering their entire emotional world around fixing broken relationships. And this creates a shocking transformation. The empath becomes harder to manipulate. Guilt stops working. Silent treatment stops working. Emotional inconsistency stops working. Because the empath finally realizes something life-changing. Any relationship that requires self-abandonment to survive is not love. It is emotional captivity. That realization awakens a new kind of strength inside them. A quieter strength, not the loud strength of revenge. Not the ego-driven strength of proving people wrong, but the calm strength of emotional boundaries. And once an empath develops real boundaries, many relationships around them begin collapsing naturally. Why? Because unhealthy people often love the empath's lack of boundaries more than the empath themselves. They love the endless access, the unconditional forgiveness, the emotional availability without accountability. But now the empath is different. They pause before giving energy. They notice manipulation faster. They stop explaining boundaries to people committed to violating them. And eventually, the empath leaves completely. Not because they stopped loving deeply, but because they finally learned that deep love should not require deep suffering. This is the part many people regret too late. Because once an empath fully detaches, reconnecting with them becomes nearly impossible. Not because they are cruel, but because they remember exactly what it cost to rebuild themselves after being emotionally destroyed. What makes an empath's disappearance so haunting is that they rarely announce the true moment they emotionally let go. By the time people notice the distance, the empath has already spent countless nights grieving silently, replaying conversations, questioning themselves, trying to understand how love slowly became emotional pain. Because empaths do not leave at the first sign of hurt. They leave after repeated emotional disappointment forces them to accept a truth they desperately wanted to avoid. Some people only appreciate loyalty after they lose access to it. And this realization changes the empath permanently. Before, they believed love could heal almost anything. Now they understand that love without mutual effort becomes self-destruction. That lesson is painful because empaths naturally want to see the best in people. They want to believe honesty can return, empathy can grow, respect can deepen. But eventually, reality overrides emotional attachment. The empath begins noticing patterns instead of promises. They stop focusing on words and start studying behavior. Who disappears when accountability appears? Who only shows affection after causing pain? Who drains emotional energy while giving almost nothing back? And once the empath sees these patterns clearly, something inside them hardens. Not into bitterness, into wisdom. This wisdom makes them emotionally dangerous to toxic people because the empath no longer reacts the same way. Manipulation loses power when someone finally sees through it. The empath becomes calmer, more observant, less emotionally accessible. And this emotional shift terrifies people who once depended on the empath's endless emotional availability. Because for the first time, the empath is no longer trying to save the relationship alone. They are saving themselves. This is when many unhealthy people suddenly panic. They sense the emotional door closing, so they return with apologies, sudden affection, promises of change, temporary vulnerability. But by this stage, the empath's intuition has awakened fully. They no longer listen only to what someone says. They listen to patterns, consistency, energy, effort. And if the behavior remains unchanged, the empath quietly continues detaching. That is the part people underestimate. Empaths may forgive emotionally, but once trust dies completely, the relationship rarely survives. Because trust is the foundation that allows empaths to feel emotionally safe enough to love deeply. Without safety, the connection becomes psychologically exhausting, and eventually, the empath chooses peace over attachment. Not because leaving is easy, but because staying has finally become harder than walking away. That decision marks the rebirth of the empath, the moment they stop abandoning themselves to keep others comfortable, the moment they realize protecting their peace is not selfish, it is survival. In the end, the most shocking thing about an empath disappearing is not the silence they leave behind. It is the emptiness people feel after they are gone. Because most people never truly understand what an empath was carrying emotionally until that energy disappears from their life completely. The encouragement, the patience, the emotional safety, the deep understanding. The ability to make people feel heard without judgment. Empaths give these things so naturally that others often mistake them as ordinary, until they vanish. And suddenly, conversations feel colder, relationships feel shallow, life feels emotionally heavier without anyone understanding why. That is the hidden power of an empath. Their presence regulates emotional chaos in ways most people cannot consciously explain. But when an empath finally reaches their limit, they stop pouring life into places that continuously drain them. And contrary to what many believe, this disappearance is not weakness, it is evolution. Because the empath eventually realizes that constantly saving others while destroying themselves is not compassion, it is self-erasure. For years, many empaths confuse suffering with loyalty. They stay available to people who repeatedly wound them because they fear becoming cold, selfish, or unloving. But maturity teaches the empath a painful truth. Boundaries are not cruelty. Distance is not hatred. And walking away from emotional destruction is not abandonment. It is wisdom. This is why healed empaths become almost impossible to manipulate. Not because they stop loving deeply, but because they finally stop confusing love with sacrifice. They no longer chase people who drain them, no longer beg for emotional consistency, no longer tolerate relationships that require them to shrink themselves to be accepted. Instead, they become selective with access, selective with energy, selective with trust, selective with emotional investment, and this transformation changes the entire atmosphere around them. The empath who once over-explained becomes silent. The empath who once tolerated disrespect becomes unreachable. The empath who once carried everyone emotionally now protects their peace fiercely. That shift often shocks the people who benefited from the empath's lack of boundaries, because they believed the empath would always stay, always forgive, always return, always endure.